Welcome to Poly Pomona's URP 3350 class, Plan Making History and Future. Today's presentation is on Urban Land Use Planning, our textbook, written by Berke, Godschalk, Kaiser, and Rodriguez. This is Chapter 4, Building Planning Support Systems, and my name is Scott Reimers. Before we jump into Chapter 4, let's talk about Chapter 3. In that chapter, we talked about what makes a good plan. And in that, we looked at three different things: the purpose of a plan, the types of a plan, and the criteria for evaluating those plans. In terms of the purpose for a plan, we looked at a general plan, which was a long-range plan, usually a 20 to 30-year time horizon. And we said that the purpose of the plan was to deal with both political and legal issues and to manage development over time. To set out where and how development should occur, to set a vision that the plan needs to be based on facts, and it's used to make short-term decision making. So when you're approving a CUP or conditional use permit or variance or anything like that, those findings are going to go back to your general plan. You're going to look for support in that general plan. And the general plan needs to be relevant to what's happening out there in the world today. So in chapter 3, we also looked at different types of plans. We looked at 4 basic different types of plans. The first one's an area-wide plan. And you might not do this when you're doing a general plan update, or you might do a similar exercise. But basically, the idea of an area-wide plan is to just show what are areas you're going to conserve, what areas will remain rural, and what areas will become urban or will continue to be urban. So really, where can we grow? Where are we not going to grow? Where are we going to preserve agriculture? So in LA or Orange County, we're not going to see a lot of those different kind of trade-offs. Usually we'll kind of skip that plan itself, but we will dive into that conversation into where should we preserve and where should we continue to grow. The second type of plan is a community-wide plan, also called a comprehensive plan or a general plan. And that's where you start to put what is the mix of land uses that are going to be allowed, what density or how intense, and the type. And those tend to be end state focused. What do we want to look like in 30 years from today? The third type of plan was a specific plan that can look somewhat like a general plan, but it's for a smaller area. It usually includes design guidelines or design standards. It's going to even have streetscape information, possibly like what types of trees you're going to plant, what is the street furniture going to look like, that sort of stuff. And it's even going to include infrastructure. And then lastly is your development management plan. That's not something we do much in California anymore because we can't really manage development as we used to. It tends to be short-term focused, and it says we're going to locate growth in this portion of the area first, and it might even specify the rate of growth, so maybe only 500 units that year or 5,000 units that year. And then it helps you figure out what infrastructure is going to be needed in order to build that development. So that was creating different types of plans. The third thing we talked about in chapter 3 was criteria for evaluating plans. There's 2 different types of criteria, if you remember. There's internal criteria and external criteria. The internal criteria included issues and vision statement. We would look at the issue and vision statement. We would look at whether it's based on fact. Is there a good framework of goal versus policy? And what about the plan proposal itself, both spatial, implementation, and monitoring? So there's the internal parts of the plan, but then there's also the external parts of evaluating the plan. Does it recognize and encourage opportunities to use the plan? So are you going to use that plan often, or is it just going to sit on a shelf? Does it create clear views and understandings of the plan? So if 5 people read it, do they all understand the same thing? Does it account for independent actions in plan scope? And does it reveal participation of formal and informal actors? So does it show you where people have made specific comments? And so that's one thing you can do is you can, things where you got a lot of community input on, like the city needs a swimming pool. That's where you can like highlight that maybe in a different color or put a text box around it to really show that that's where you got a lot of community comment. So let's turn to chapter 4, building planning support systems. So the idea here is that when you're updating a general plan or a specific plan, you need to create some support systems so that you can do that well. So you need to be able to understand what are the physical things that are changing, the social things, the economic things. So I would divide it into those three categories. And like any sort of operation, like if you can imagine Jack Ryan or 007, their main job is to just get intelligence, what's happening out there in the field. And so there's a part of your time as a planner where you're just going to be really focused on gathering information or intelligence. You're going to want to gather information on the population, the economy of your city, or the economy of your specific plan area. What are the different land uses that are out there? How much of them are there? How many units are there? How much square footage of retail versus office? Where are they located? How quickly have things been changing? And for instance, in Pasadena, we did a whole thing we called the metrics report. And we went through and we really tried to catalog what had changed since the last time we did a major general plan update in 1994, and what had changed to the date at that time. So we put together the metrics report that looked at a lot of that stuff. How had we grown? How had the economy changed? What was unemployment looking like? How had we build affordable housing? And put that metrics report together so that it could inform the decisions later on in the general plan update. So when we look at planning support system technologies, we can see that the amount of data has definitely increased. So whether we're looking at GIS information or analytical models or the internet or these different tools, the amount of data has certainly improved. So it used to be that we only got good data every 10 years with the decennial census. So as you remember, the Constitution says that we're going to do a census every 10 years. We've now changed the decennial census, and we don't rely on that as much because we now do the American Community Survey, where we get updates every, I think, 3 to 5 years, and we get new estimates. Well, every year we get new estimates, and you get a 3-year estimate or a 5-year estimate. So we're getting more data. Problem with the American Community Survey is that it's not as accurate as the decennial census. Um, and then we're also getting cell phone data now. So we can collect data, where people travel to, where they go, all that sort of stuff using cell phone data. Our ability to analyze data has improved drastically. You used to sit down with a chart and like try to just draw out the numbers. So you had a number of data points and you just put that in a chart. So you'd have data, but analyzing it was not as easy. Now using Excel, you can really put in a lot of data and start really analyzing the data, not just looking at it or graphing it, but analyzing it. And now with artificial intelligence, we can do even a better job of analyzing data. You put in a lot of data, and it can start churning through it to see, look for trends and forecasting and so forth. Our ability to present data has also improved from just Excel and the data that you can show there to also GIS. So now with geographic information systems, it's pretty easy now to show data geographically and to start plotting stuff. So you can see the connections between maybe the age of homes and the location in your city, and you can see how the city's developed over the last 50 years. And there's also some GIS Lite programs. You can, in Google Maps, you can start doing some creating layers if you wanted to do that. Available to cities are some other programs. We use Connect Explorer in Temple City. We used a thing in Pasadena called IMAP that allowed you to do some GIS Lite work. So let's talk about GIS. We're not going to get too far into that in this class. That's not the purpose of this class. We're just going to give you the very basics, elementary understanding of it. But your GIS systems the goal is to take data and to show it in a geographic manner. So it's that connection between having data but showing it on a map. So whether it's population or trips where people are leaving and coming from, it's not just showing that in a table, but showing it on a map. So that can be very helpful. It can help you find trends and patterns about your city or about the larger area. It can also assist with communicating data. We used it a lot in Pasadena, and I used it. We had a request from a neighborhood along Los Robles to do a zone change. So it was really helpful to look at the area that they wanted us to change the zoning for and start looking at things like the age of the buildings, what condition were the buildings in, what was the density of the area, and start putting together all of this data and then start showing it in maps. So you could start seeing, well, maybe this area of the study area should change, but this other area probably shouldn't change because um, what people had said really didn't bear out. So it was really helpful in doing that sort of analysis. Your geographic layer can rely on points, which is just really a point on the map. It can rely on a line, or it can rely on a polygon. So you got points, lines, and polygons. A polygon is just a shape. It could be any shape, square, circle, triangle, prism. And so between those two things, you've got data, and you've got data, and you've got a map, right? And then your goal is to connect those two things. So your data is in an attribute table. So you'll have a table, and it says this polygon or this area, area 1, we'll call it area 1, has a population of so much. Area 2 has a population of so much. Area 3 has a population of so much. And so the idea is that then you show where area 1 is on the map, and area 2 and area 3, and then it will plot those different values. It can show them in different colors or different hatchings or whatever. So GIS really becomes helpful where you start putting multiple layers on a map, and then you can start to see really where you can really start to analyze it at that point. So another exercise we did for a hospital expansion was to plot out where the best place was on this hospital site to build new housing and to build a new hospital building. So we looked at we had a layer that showed where the existing buildings were, where the buildings were that were historically significant. We showed where all the trees were on the property, some of which were invasive, some which were naturally occurring. We showed the view corridors. So we had all these different layers, and we started to layer them on top of each other. And as we layered them on top of each other, we found that, oh well, maybe we could put the hospital building here because that's one big massive structure. Because there's no other buildings in this area and it doesn't ruin the view shed. And then in this area, we could put some smaller buildings, so we could do some smaller residential buildings because they're not going to, we can build them around some existing trees. We can build them a little bit lower so that they're not dealing with the view shed. So that sort of analysis can be really helpful. So where do we get GIS data from? There's a lot of different sources and there's a lot of different data that could be out there that's helpful. Our data sources in California usually come down to 5 different areas, but there's a ton of data out there right now. There's the Southern California Association of Government, which has been really focusing on for the last few years on being a warehouse of data. So SCAG's always a good place to go to. They've got their map books, and you can download all of their layers and use them. State and federal government has a lot of data, especially if you're looking for soils data or earthquake information, fault lines, that sort of stuff. The state has also produced its special mapping system, CalEnviroScan. There's also, you might have some local data you want to show, maybe regarding business licenses. You could start showing where different types of businesses are. Utility data, if your city has a utility, you can start plotting things like usage of water per acre. So you can see what areas of your city are using more water per acre versus less water. And more recently, there's a lot of private data out there as well. So you can start gathering information based on cell phone data and other data sources. So what is some helpful data that you might be looking at? One is parcel valuation. So what areas of the city are more valuable than other areas where the parcel values are high? If parcel values are low, that might be an area where you want to put in development, or might be an area where you want to create some revitalization programs. But parcel valuation in California is tricky information because with Prop 13, what we said as a state was we're not going to come out and revalue the property every year or every few years as they do in other states. The property is only revalued when the property is sold and when there's a major building permit on the property. So if the property hasn't sold for 40 years and no major construction's been done, the property valuation that's recorded at the county recorder's office could be 40 years old. So you've got to be careful when using parcel valuation information. Structure conditions. So that might be something you want to map if there's an area in your city where the condition of structures is poor. You might need to create a layer that shows that. That's something generally that you're going to have your local planners go out and help assess. We use this in housing elements. In housing elements, we have to, if we're going to say that a site is going to turn over and see growth, that you have to prove that. And one of the things you can prove that is by showing that the property is in poor condition. If the property is in really, really good condition, it's not likely that it's going to turn over. Another data source is infrastructure condition and capacity. You might have a map from your stormwater map, your sewer map, your sewer master plan, that shows where your major sewer lines are and what's the condition and capacity of that sewer line. So if you don't have a lot of capacity in the area, you probably don't want to have more growth there, or you may need to make sure that you're increasing the capacity. Transportation systems, so you'll have layers probably showing where sidewalks are, your street network, obviously, bicycle lanes, the different types of bike lanes. And then you should also need to know about, under transportation systems, you'll have the TAZ, your transportation analysis zone. So these are kind of like census block groups where you have a few blocks in your city that are combined in one polygon. And then when you're doing your transportation analysis at a general plan level, you're just trying to really figure out how many vehicles are going from TAZ area 1 to TAZ area 2, or to TAZ area 3 or TAZ area 4. You might have tree data showing where trees are located, different types of, and then so you can figure out where you need to plant more trees in the public right of way. You have hazard maps. You need to really look at those. So if FEMA's doing your flood maps, you'll need to include those FEMA flood maps. You'll be looking at the USGS fault zones. You're not going to want to propose tall growth or tall buildings along your fault zones. Liquefaction areas. You need to know where those are so you can plan accordingly for that. Accident data and crime data, you could ask for that data. It's definitely difficult to get from a sheriff's department or from a police department. They like to hoard the data that they have, but that can also be helpful information. Energy and water usage information. Southern California Edison will provide you energy information. They do require you to sign a whole bunch of waivers saying that you're not going to release it and that it's private data. Sometimes the data you get from the utilities are kind of anonymized, or I think they're usually anonymized, so you don't know who specifically is using how much. And sometimes it's aggregated so that it's like a whole block rather than just a single lot. Business types, so you'll have a map possibly that shows where your retail businesses are, personal service, your institutions, your industrial areas, that sort of stuff. Conservation maps, areas that need to be conserved because of plant material or for animals. You're going to look at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, if there's any protected species. And then, as I mentioned earlier, CalEnviroscreen in California provides a lot of helpful information. So there's all this different data we talked about. You've got your geographic layer and your attribute layer. So here you can see in this screenshot, you've got a map here, and on that map, you've got some different polygons and shapes. And then below that map, you've got your attribute table. And the attribute table is showing you a number of of different tracts, 1 through 13, and then it's giving you information about those tracts. And then so in the map layer, you can change how those different things appear using different colors or different schemes. So that's the mapping layer and your attribute table. So I would say one of the important things when managing a GIS system is maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. Maintenance of data is vital. You need to make sure that your data is continuing to be updated as new data is released. Also, metadata is essential. Um, Metadata is data about data, information about data. So let's say you have a table that says that the population of this area is 10,000 people. How old is that? Where did you get it from? What table is it taken from? Is it, if it's census data, did it come from the decennial census, or is it an estimate of data from the California Department of Finance? Data about data, metadata is very important. It helps you figure out when the data is outdated and when it needs to be updated. So there's different types of modeling and models you can use as a planner when you're doing an update or when you're creating a new plan. We want to talk about the usage of those, and we want to talk about the different types of them. What these models do is they allow you as a planner to see the result of your proposed changes. So let's say you had a downtown area and you wanted to just to have more commercial growth down there, more offices and such. So you zoned it C1 for commercial one. How would that look like? How would it change traffic patterns? How would it change population? How would it change your city's finances? There's new models that will do all of that for you. So if you, instead of changing it to C1 and you changed it to multifamily, allowing 32 units per acre, how would that impact the city's finances? How would that impact employment and income and your number of housing units? What would be the new impact of creating a new transit facility? Or what's the impact of a project on air quality? If we put a whole bunch of people near the freeway and we upzone that area, how many more sensitive receptors do we have near the freeway area? So these new tools, these analytical models, allow you to see the physical result or allow you to see the results from a data perspective of the changes you made geographically. So I change the zone of this area. What's the result in terms of data and numbers by making that change? So there's different types of analytical models. There's just Excel spreadsheets. We use this for air quality analysis all the time. We put in a bunch of data and it runs through a set of formulas and we get the result. Traffic models, we put in the data and then out comes the results. The LOS, the level of service at that intersection change? Did the number of vehicle miles traveled changed? Did it go up or down? So we've got these different types of spreadsheet models. There's those. But then there's also some complex growth simulation models, the one I was talking to you about before. These would even include sometimes 3D visualization. So you have a map and you put all the different zones on the map, and then it will do a 3D visualization of what it would look like. And then it would go through a whole bunch of different number crunching and stuff to show you whether you've improved the environment, to improve equity, to improve the economy, so forth and so on. These different simulation models required a lot of different inputs and scenarios. So you can put in all these different scenarios and see how they affect the different things you're trying to measure. It can analyze a whole bunch of different impacts. It might not be valid, and that would be my main concern. Like any model, if you put bad data into it, you're going to get bad data out of it. But I would say that they are reliable. So you keep putting in the same data, you're going to keep getting similar results. So in that way, they're reliable, and it helps you do some comparison between the different scenarios. So let's say you have 4 different land use scenarios. You can put those all through the same model, and at least you can compare the different alternatives. So while it might not be valid or accurate, It strives for that kind of reliability and the ability to compare the models or the scenarios against each other. So when we did the general plan in Pasadena, we used a program called Community Viz, and Community Viz did just that. We developed 4 different land use scenarios with the community. Through prior community engagement, we asked the public what were important metrics that they wanted to use to review these different plans. And then we got data about those, we put them into Community Viz, and then we measured each of those alternatives against those different metrics. And so we looked at things like VMT per capita. So were we going to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled per person using that alternative? Were we going to improve the city's finances? Were we going to increase the number of housing units, increase the amount of jobs? And so we put all these scenarios through it, and then we developed a series of bar charts where you could look at the different scenarios and see how they performed differently between each other. So another support system that we use in planning is the internet. Now, I think you're all very familiar with the internet now. It's kind of ridiculous to spend a lot of time on this. It's very powerful. It's great for sharing information. The authors, of course, bring up issues of equity of access to the internet. Who has it? Who has the ability to connect to it? That was also a major issue during COVID-19. Like, did people have the ability to get online and take classes and connect with the internet? I think with how prevalent the internet has become, maybe not so much of an issue as it once was. Maybe it is still of an issue, but not as big as it was. Another planning support system is visualization and communication programs. So these are programs that help us take these different theories that we're putting out there and putting them into practice. So it might help us take a different one land use scenario and see what it's going to look like so that the public can see it. So it takes theory to practice. It helps the public understand. It could just be a site plan. So if you're doing a large specific plan, it could look at a site plan for an area. So you've got the property lines and where the building would be located, how tall it would be, and then it would have usually a massing model. So it might look like a big brown block or a big gray block that's sitting in the parking lot or up near the front of the site. And so you'd have a kind of a model of, is it a 1-story building? Is it a 4-story building? What's adjacent to it? Is it another 2-story building, or is it just a parking lot? And then you could even get to the point, depending on the system you're using, to have detailed elevations. So it might actually show you what the building would look like with windows and doors and so forth. There's usually two major decision points when it comes to using a massing model versus a detailed elevation model. Your massing models are easier, they're cheaper to build, they're not as attractive though. So when you're dealing with the public, if you've got a really difficult public or a very picky public, you probably don't want to choose a massing model because it just looks like a big gray box sitting on a site. The other way to go is more with a detailed elevation. The problem with that is that it can be very expensive, but it does make the building look a lot more attractive. Everybody would rather see a building with doors and windows and a roof rather than just seeing some big block. So these are usually provided to help people take what the ideas that are being put out there and to help them see what it would look like being put into practice. So in this last section of this lecture, of chapter 4, we have been focusing on planning support systems. Now we really want to focus on the functions that they perform. So the first one is these planning support systems help us describe history, the current state, and policies. And so in the Pasadena General Plan, when we were working on that, we would look at things like, we would look at data that would help us decide, does this site have the history of the site? Does this site have a prior use that maybe had toxic substances in it? So that would be part of the history of the site. Was there a dry cleaner there? Was there auto repair? Was there metal plating? What is the history of this site or this neighborhood that we might need to plan around? When was this area built out? We need to figure that out. So there might be some history there that we need to preserve. Were there adobes on this site, in this area? Were there Native American tribes in this area that we need to account for the history there as well? So knowing the history of the site, very important. Knowing the current state of the site. How much of the site is improved? If the FAR allows 2.0 and only a tenth of the site is being used, then the current state of the site is underdeveloped. And so you might see or plan for more development in that area in the future. What's the existing use of the site? Are the existing sites residential? Are they industrial? Is it retail? And then what are the current policies that are in place? So you're going to want to know what's the current zoning. Planners will know the rules about FAR and density and use, but areas with a mix of uses, sometimes you might have areas where you have pyramidal zoning, where you have those areas might have a mix of different uses in them. So these planning support systems also provide us the function of monitoring, recording, and interpreting changes. And so looking at changes since the last general plan update or specific plan update can also be important. So we would look at things like what sites have developed, where are we seeing development? Are we seeing development in industrial areas? Maybe industrial areas tend to have a lot of parking and large buildings. So are we seeing those sites develop? Maybe they're turning into warehouses. Are we seeing sites with very small houses on large lots? Maybe those are developing into multifamily properties. Are we seeing residential sites in industrial areas turning into industrial sites? So what sites are developing? Maybe what new uses are we seeing? Maybe not just within the area, maybe we're seeing some full service dining, maybe we're seeing a lot more casual dining, or are we seeing more quick serve dining? Are we seeing drive-through? What's changing? What are we seeing on the horizon? And how has parking demand changed? So after COVID, are we seeing a lot more people parking? Are we seeing a lot more kind of takeout parking, like people are just coming in, picking up food and leaving? Are we seeing more demand for ride-sharing services like Uber, or are we just seeing more demand for Uber Eats and kind of those types of things? So what changes are happening out there? So in terms of forecasting future status, projections are very important. From a housing perspective, we have the regional housing needs allocation or regional housing needs assessment that will set both current and future housing need for an agency. We currently have problem as plans have been made for the next 10 years, but future demand appears to be leveling off. So we'll see where the next set of RENA numbers go. It's definitely harder to project commercial and industrial need than it is residential need. We have very clear direction from the state, HCD, and SCAG on housing need, but commercial and industrial need is harder to come by. So often with a general plan update, you'll also hire an economist to help you to figure out the demand for commercial and industrial space. So really what you're going to be answering questions like, do we really need more Amazon warehouses? How will employment change if we zone an area this way? As we see a lot less manufacturing jobs, auto repair jobs, for instance, become really good paying alternatives for blue collar work. Job training also becomes more important to pull people out of service jobs and into other types of jobs. And so you also want to look at like how does growth in different age groups, how does that affect demand for schools and convalescent homes? I can remember back in the year 2000, there was lots of concern about baby boomers aging, and there was like all these pharmacies coming in, Long's Drugs and CVS and Rite Aid. We're all trying to put like a drugstore, it seemed like, at every corner. And now we're actually seeing CVS closing a lot of stores. And so as your population changes in age and in other demographics, you're going to have to plan for that change. So we're also going to have to diagnose planning and development problems. So most changes are gradual, so it gives you time to see the problem and adjust accordingly. Decision makers, I should warn you, are usually reluctant to deal with issues until a crisis occurs. So I think some people could say that that's the way it happened with housing, that the housing need just continued to increase and increase and increase. And a lot of decision makers were unwilling to deal with that until a crisis occurred. We see places like Pomona that had a major change when General Dynamics left. A major employer for Pomona left, and Pomona quickly lost a lot of good paying jobs. And so in that case, it wasn't a gradual change. Sometimes it's a cataclysmic change that happens. Um, so, taking account of those things and being ready to adjust accordingly is important. So assessing supply and demand, also very important. I think we've talked about that in a number of different aspects above, but you're going to need to look at the supply of things like housing and then the demand of housing. And obviously for industrial and commercial growth, that's where you may need to bring in some experts to help you, economists and so forth, to help you with that piece. So there's a lot of good models out there that can help you look at the changes, assess the changes that are being proposed, look at the relationships between your different scenarios and what those would impact in. So for Pasadena, for instance, with the general plan update, we hired a consultant to help us do just that, to put together a model and to help us see what the impacts of each alternative scenario would be. So likely what you would do is you would go through a city, you would mark areas that you think are going to develop or actually specific properties that are going to develop. And then you'd provide a number of different assessments for them. Things like what's the household size based on different densities. So at a single family density, what's the household size going to be versus at a high density site. And then when you start plotting out where the high density sites are, you'll see a change in the population based on that. So you're going to provide all these projection numbers. And then you'll also provide them some different scenarios on how development occur, what density or intensity of the development will be, and what uses there will be, and then where they will be located. And then the model spits out all this data that you can look at to compare the different scenarios. So it'll give you information about population, land value, demand on services, and so forth. So this is used, it's harder to do this type of work in an infill area because you have properties that aren't going to change and properties that will. It's very important though, you'll see if you're doing greenfield development, areas that had never seen development before, because then you can start to note like where you have wetlands and hillsides, liquefaction areas, areas that are environmentally sensitive due to species. If you have wildfire hazard areas, you can start marking those on your map. And then you can show different scenarios based on where you would site development, based on all those different kind of conservation areas. So then you have to take all this and communicate it both to your decision makers, to your stakeholders, and to as much of the community as you can get to. And there are, seems like countless ways of communicating stuff to all those different groups of people. Now, I would suggest that the more of these pathways you use, the better, because the best thing you want is for the public to know what's being proposed, come to meetings and provide their input. But the worst thing what you don't want to happen is for people to show up and say, well, I didn't know about these things. No one ever told us. And then when council looks at you and they say, well, what did you do in terms of outreach? And you only talk about like one community meeting, not going to go over well. So then they'll send you out again to do additional work. And then this time you will have a whole bunch of people who are unhappy because they felt like you purposefully left them out. So a good thing to do is do a bunch of these different things. And then when people say, well, I never heard about it, and council looks at you and says, tell us, what did you do in terms of outreach? You go through this long laundry list of all these things. And then it kind of makes it seem like, well, geez, these people were just disconnected almost purposefully. and that you did all the good work and they just ignored it. So that's kind of what you want to happen. Best case scenario, though, is you do all this work and people show up, they're happy with the end result, and nobody comes to your meeting negative. So let's talk about these different tools that you have out there. Obviously, you have your website, your city website. The most difficult part of that, honestly, is to keep it up to date with what's happened, what decisions have been made, and what's upcoming. So set a reminder on your calendar to keep that updated every month. There's notification systems. Your city will probably have a notification system to keep residents notified via email and text messaging. You could have people sign up for text messaging so they know what's the next event. And then that's where you're going to start to insert yourself into other people's emails. So like the city manager newsletter that goes out every week, you're going to want to put stuff about the general plan. You can even partner with some nonprofits in your city to see if they can help advertise your upcoming general plan events or keep people informed that way. Obviously, there's social media platforms. You've got Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and all these different means you can use for social media. Print magazines. So a lot of cities will put out a magazine that talks about, often it's most likely parks events, but sometimes it's a newspaper that just talks about general interest stories that are happening in the city. So you'll want to advertise in there. You can advertise online so that you can buy Facebook ads or you can buy social media advertising. We even bought advertising in buses once. You can put flyers all over the city. You're going to want to leave flyers at your library, at your senior centers. I've seen lawn banners. People put banners up on their front lawns and give them away to get the word out about the general plan. Street banners, banners that go over the street, you can advertise using that. Public notice signs. A lot of cities have their own cable news channel. You'll want to put some advertising on that. Go to your council meetings and your commission meetings and speak during public comment and tell people about what's happening with the general plan. There's also old school newspapers, and you can put out press releases and hoping that the press picks up and writes an article on it. You could set up a blog. I know that's kind of old school now, but you could set up a blog so you can blog about what's happening with the general plan. There's direct mail, so you can get a hold of both businesses and residents in your community. That's something we used in Pasadena to we sent information about the different scenarios and asked them to take a survey. We sent mail to every single address in the city. You can pass out flyers, just stand outside of a grocery store or outside of a major retailer and just pass out flyers about upcoming events. I've done that. You can set up a booth at a public event. So if your city puts on like a summer carnival, if your city puts on a Cinco de Mayo festival or some Lunar New Year festival or any other festival, put up a booth and give out information about what's happening with the general plan. Go out and meet people. Also, if your city has community groups, you can go out to their meetings and kind of insert yourself in there and just give them an update about what's happening. You could also offer tours of the city. We did in Pasadena a really creative thing where we wanted people to give us feedback on the city by bike or the city by our local transit service. So we set up a series of tours, and then we gave them a prize if they went and got off at the stops, went into a retailer, and got a stamp on their book. So there's that. And then just doing survey work. There's a lot of great consultants out there that can help you put together some good surveys. So all of this intelligence gathering and using all these different support systems should result in something like a state of the community report. That might not be what you call it. It's probably what you shouldn't call it. We call it in Pasadena the metrics report, but all of that will end up being in some sort of report. It's important to keep that report updated regularly. You probably want to update that every year so that when you start having a conversation with someone, you've got that information at the ready. So as a hint, make sure you have good sources. You keep track of all your sources so that you can just click that hyperlink, double check the data, and go back and update it regularly. Cities often, I'll just be frank with you, are just usually bad at this, keeping data updated. Usually we're running and trying to put out fires, trying to deal with this situation or that situation, and we're very bad at monitoring these data sources. So keep them up to date, put it in an interesting format. I think there's so much good stuff you can do nowadays with making graphs and charts much more interesting, um, using cartoons and stuff like that. So maybe even with AI, you can start doing some of that. But make it interesting, make it something that somebody wants to look at. It should probably coincide with your annual state reports. So there are annual reports you have to prepare for the state. So as you're preparing those, you can update these different plan making processes. So probably at the end of the fiscal year, you're going to want to update some of the data sources. At the end of the calendar year, you're going to update different sources. And then when you submit your annual progress report to HCD and Land Use Climate Innovation Department, Lucy, you're going to want to update that. And so that's something we do regularly in Temple City. We do an annual report of a bunch of different community development data sources. And I've talked about the Pasadena Metrics Plan report often in this meeting already. So in summary, chapter 4, we talked about building planning support systems. There's a lot of different sources to go to. You've got GIS, you've got all these sophisticated analytical models. Obviously, you have the internet as a tool. And then we talked about these different visualization and communication programs, CommunityVis being one of them. And then we talked about the different, all the different functions that are incorporated into planning support systems. And that included describing the history, the current state and policies, monitoring, recording, and interpreting changes, forecasting future status, diagnosing planning and development problems, assessing supply and demand, model changes, relationships, and impacts, and communicating all of those things to your decision makers and stakeholders. So that concludes chapter 4.